In this cutting outside the lines video, I'm going to show you how you can add a lining to a garment. I'm using the copper dress, which you can find at dittopatterns.com. I've already cut out the dress front and back, as well as lining pieces out of the front and back. I also cut the facing pieces that come with the pattern. For this tutorial, I'm also using a two-sided fusible web to help add my facings to my lining. In addition to cutting the facings out of your fashion fabric, cut a set out of the fusible web. We're then going to remove the seam allowance on the fusible web. Remove the seam allowance from only the exterior parts of the facings. You want to leave it on anywhere you're going to attach it to the neckline, or in this case, the keyhole. Repeat this step on any other fusible facing pieces you may have. Next, we're going to adhere our fusible web to our facing piece. With the paper backing side up, place the fusible web on your facing piece and iron to hold in place. The Ditto pattern weights come in handy for holding your fusible web to your facing as you iron. Repeat this step on the other facing pieces. Next, peel off the paper backing from your fusible facing. If you have any corners in your facings, you can clip them as needed. We're then going to lightly iron our seam allowance into that fusible web. Be careful not to iron into the fusible web itself, as it can leave a residue on your iron. Next, line up the facing piece to your previously cut lining piece. The lining piece is cut the same as your fashion fabric. Once lined up, you can use your iron to adhere the facing to the lining. For extra hold before sewing, pin the edges of your seam allowance into place on the lining. We can now top stitch our facing to the lining piece. Using my foot as a guide, I'm just sewing about 1/8 inch in from that folded seam allowance on the facing. When you get to a corner, lift the foot up, sink the needle down, Pivot your garment, foot down, and continue to sew. Repeat this process on any other lining pieces that you would like to have faced. Once all your lining pieces are prepared with their facings, you can begin putting the lining together as you would the regular fashion fabric pieces. On this dress, I'm sewing the center back, as well as the shoulder seams and side seams. When lining a garment, we want the lining to be just short of our fashion fabric. So take a moment to shorten your hem before continuing on. For this dress, I folded the dress in half so the center back and center fronts matched, and I'm taking off 5/8 of an inch. I've already put together the shoulder seams, side seams, and center back of my garment. We can now attach our lining to the outer fashion fabric piece. Place the outer fabric piece and the lining piece together with right sides together. I use the shoulder seam and other markings to line everything up around the neckline. If your garment has sleeves, I suggest adding the lining before the sleeves. This copper dress has sleeves. Pin or clip the neckline together. Once pinned or clipped, we can now sew around the neckline with a 5/8 seam allowance. Once the neckline is sewn together, you can clip down your seam allowance and clip into the curves as needed. Next, turn your garment right side out and press your seam allowances towards the lining. With the seam allowance pressed towards the lining, understitch the neckline. I'm sewing about 1/4 inch from the neckline seam. Understitching is what keeps the lining and facing from rolling out to the outside of your garment. Once sewn, you can press the lining in place. Once the neckline is completed, we can move on to the sleeve holes or arm's eye. This copper dress has a sleeve, so I'm going to take a moment to line up the lining and the fashion fabric front. I'll then continue on with the pattern instructions for adding the sleeves and hemming the dress. For more tips, tricks, and tutorials, sign up for our email newsletter at dittopatterns.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel.